My new boss scheduled the all-hands meeting for 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, which should have been my first warning. Nobody calls a full company meeting on a Tuesday morning to announce good news. 312 employees logged into the Zoom call. I know the exact number because I'd helped coordinate the original company-wide meeting system back when we barely had 40 people and a single conference room that smelled like old carpet. I was sitting at my desk in my home office, coffee still brewing, still in a dress shirt and pajama pants because nobody checks below the frame. I watched the little participant count tick upward and thought about how strange it was that a company could feel so large and so small at the same time. My new boss appeared on screen looking like he'd just walked off a consulting firm brochure. 41 years old, MBA from Wharton, hired 6 months ago by the board to modernize our operations at Hargrove Freight Solutions. He wore the kind of fitted blazer that costs more than most people's car payments, and smiled like he'd been practicing in the mirror since 6 in the morning. He opened with some remarks about transformation and velocity and competitive positioning in a shifting market landscape. Standard vocabulary for someone who learned about business from PowerPoint decks rather than from actually running one. Then he said my name. Not to thank me. Not to acknowledge the 17 years I'd spent building Hargrove from a regional operation into one of the largest independent freight brokers in the Southeast. He said my name the way a surgeon says scalpel, with the flat detachment of someone performing a procedure they've already rehearsed 100 times. One of the changes we're making today, he said, clicking to a new slide that showed a company org chart with my box highlighted in red, is retiring certain legacy relationship models that no longer align with our data-driven future. That includes the role of regional client director. He looked directly into the camera. Effective immediately, that position is being eliminated. We want to thank our outgoing director for his years of service. 311 people watched me get cut from the org chart like a sticky note someone finally decided to peel off. I didn't say a word in the chat, didn't turn my camera on. I just reached over, picked up the external hard drive sitting next to my keyboard, the one I'd been using to back up 17 years of client relationship notes, meeting summaries, personal preference logs, informal pricing commitments, and the handwritten birthday and anniversary reminders I kept for 34 of our most important accounts, and I set it face down on my desk. Then I closed my laptop. My wife was standing in the doorway with my coffee. She'd heard enough of it to understand what had just happened. She set the mug down next to my keyboard without saying anything, which is how I knew she was furious on my behalf. We've been married 26 years. I know every register of her silence. I sat there for a while, the way you do when something has happened that hasn't fully arrived yet. The firing itself hadn't surprised me. I'd felt it building for 3 months ever since my new boss had called my client management approach charmingly analog in a leadership meeting, the same way you'd describe a typewriter sitting in a museum. What surprised me was the public nature of it. 300 people, a red box on an org chart. No transition period, no private conversation, no acknowledgement of what I actually did for the company. I thought about the call I'd had that Thursday with our biggest account, a retail distribution company out of Atlanta that had been with Hargrove for 11 years. Their logistics director and I had shaken hands literally in person over lunch at a steakhouse on a rate adjustment for their Q1 contract renewal. The renewal paperwork hadn't been processed yet. That handshake was the only thing keeping $4.2 million in annual revenue from going back out to bid. It was not in the CRM system. It was not in an email chain. It lived entirely in my memory and in the trust I'd built with their logistics director over a decade of early morning phone calls and last-minute problem solving, and once, memorably, personally driving to their distribution center at 11 p.m. on a December night because a shipment of holiday inventory had been misrouted and their VP of operations was threatening to end the relationship on the spot. I'd saved that contract with my presence and my word, the same way I'd saved or grown dozens of others. I went to my home office closet and pulled out a 3-inch binder that I'd been maintaining since my second year at Hargrove. Inside were handwritten notes on every major account, not financial data, which was all in the system but the human layer that no system ever captures. How our contact at one of our Midwestern trucking partners liked to be reached by phone, never email, because his company's email system flagged outside vendors as spam and he'd never fixed it. How the procurement director at a grocery chain in Tennessee had a standing personal policy of never signing contracts in December because of a bad experience she'd had early in her career, and how Hargrove had always honored that rhythm. How one of our longest tenured clients had given us a second chance after a damaged shipment 8 years ago, specifically because I had shown up to their facility in person, accepted responsibility without deflecting, and had a replacement organized before they'd finished expressing their frustration. None of that was in a database. My new boss had eliminated the role without ever asking what the role actually contained. I closed the binder and put it on my kitchen table. By Wednesday morning, my phone was already warm. The first call came from the logistics director at our Atlanta account. He was professional about it, the way long-standing business relationships make people professional even when they're confused and a little unsettled. "Hey, I heard you're no longer with Hargrove," he said. "Just wanted to reach out personally. Who am I supposed to be working with on the renewal?" I told him I didn't know, but that he should contact our sales team directly. There was a pause. "We never finalized the rate adjustment in writing," he said. "Not as an accusation, just as a fact, floating between us." "I know," I said. Another pause. "Okay, I'll reach out." He did reach out. What he found was a sales coordinator who had no record of any verbal agreement, a new client services system that had been implemented 3 weeks earlier and had imported all of the account history except the informal notes, and a manager who offered him the standard rate, which was 14% higher than what we'd discussed over lunch. He called me back that afternoon. "They're quoting me rack rate," he said. "That's not what we talked about." "I understand. I need you to confirm the agreement. I'm no longer authorized to represent Hargrove." The silence that followed was the kind that signals a decision being made. The second call I fielded came from a woman I'd worked with for 9 years, the VP of supply chain at a regional grocery distributor in the Carolinas. She didn't bother with pleasantries because, after 9 years, we'd moved past them. "What happened over there?" she asked. I explained as briefly as I could. "That's unfortunate," she said, with the specific flatness that business people use when they mean something stronger. "I was going to call you anyway about our service credit. We had 3 delayed shipments in October, and you and I had agreed verbally on a credit against next quarter's invoice. Is that documented anywhere?" It wasn't. The service credit had been my solution to a problem, brokered informally, on a call that neither of us had expected to result in a formal commitment. It existed because she trusted that I would make sure it happened. Without me at Hargrove, she had no mechanism for collecting on a promise that no one else at the company knew existed. "I'd recommend getting that in writing with your new contact," I said. "Sooner rather than later." She thanked me. I could tell from her tone that she was already updating her internal evaluation of the vendor relationship. The third call that week came from a freight partner we'd worked with for 6 years, a family-owned carrier out of Birmingham that had given Hargrove favorable lane rates in exchange for volume commitments I had personally negotiated. Their owner called me on my cell because my cell was the only number he'd ever used. "Your new operations person called me today," he said. "Offered me a new rate sheet. It's lower than what we've been getting." I asked him to describe the offer, about 8% less per lane. "But it doesn't include the volume guarantee. You and I always kept that verbal. Didn't seem like we needed paper on it." "That's correct. We didn't. Is the volume guarantee still in effect?" I had to tell him the honest answer, which was that I didn't know what commitments Hargrove intended to honor, because no one at Hargrove had asked me before eliminating my role. He went quiet for a moment. "That puts me in a tough spot," he said. "I've turned down other opportunities based on your commitment. I've staffed around that volume." "I understand. Would you be willing to put something in writing on Hargrove's behalf?" "I can't. I don't represent them anymore." He said he appreciated my honesty. What he didn't say, but what I understood clearly, was that the foundation of the business relationship had just shifted in a way that would take months to either repair or replace. I kept a legal pad on my kitchen table that week. Every time a call came in, I wrote down the name of the account, the nature of the issue, and whether it was something a CRM system could have predicted. By Friday, I had 14 accounts listed. 8 of them involved informal commitments that existed only in the institutional memory my new boss had decided to retire. My former assistant called me on Thursday. She'd been with Hargrove for 4 years and had watched the transition closely enough to understand what was happening. "The new client services system keeps flagging accounts as incomplete," she told me quietly. "Turns out a lot of the account fields were never filled in because you knew the information and it didn't seem necessary to duplicate it. Nobody realized how much was just in your head." I asked her how the team was handling the inbound calls. "We're trying," she said, "but some of these clients have been with us since before I started. They're asking questions we can't answer." I asked her to send my regards to the colleagues I'd worked closely with, not because it would fix anything, but because they weren't responsible for any of this, and they deserved to know they hadn't been forgotten. The week 2 situation I hadn't anticipated arrived in the form of a client. I'll call our Ohio client a large regional retailer who had been with Hargrove for 8 years and represented roughly 6% of our annual revenue. Their VP of operations, called our main line, was transferred twice, spent 20 minutes on hold, and then reached a sales coordinator who had been hired 4 months ago and had never spoken to him before. He eventually found my cell number through a mutual contact and called me directly. "I have a renewal meeting in 12 days, he said. "Your company has sent me 3 different contacts in the last week. None of them seem to know the history of our account, and the proposal they emailed me has the wrong tonnage estimate because they pulled it from 2019 data. I need to know who I'm supposed to be talking to." I told him that I was no longer with Hargrove and that I couldn't serve as his contact. "Is there anyone there who knows our account?" he asked. I was honest. Not in the way I did. Not yet. He said he understood and thanked me. Then he said something I've thought about since. "We've been loyal to Hargrove for 8 years because of you specifically. Not because of the rates, not because of the technology, because when something went wrong, I knew you'd pick up the phone. I don't know who picks up the phone now." His renewal meeting came and went. 2 weeks later, his account moved to a competitor. The founder flew back from his sabbatical during week 3. He'd been in Portugal for 6 weeks, part of a slow travel retirement plan he'd announced at the previous year's holiday party, with the kind of pride that comes from building something over 30 years and finally feeling safe enough to step back. He'd been generous with the transition, given my new boss full operational authority, and trusted the board's judgment in selecting someone to modernize the company. I heard he landed on a Wednesday morning and was in the office by noon. My former assistant called me that evening. "The founder spent 3 hours with the head of sales today," she said. "I've never seen him look like that before." She described his expression as the particular stunned exhaustion of a man who has just learned that the house he thought was fully renovated has been doing something quietly catastrophic to its foundation while he was away. I wasn't surprised when the general counsel called me the following Monday. He was careful and measured, the way lawyers are when they're navigating something that has multiple potential outcomes. "We need to understand the current state of our client commitments," he said. "Specifically any informal agreements that may not be reflected in our CRM system. We'd like to have a conversation, if you're willing." I asked whether I was being called as a potential witness, a consultant, or something else. At this stage, just as an informed former employee whose perspective would help us assess the situation accurately. I agreed to come in. Not out of loyalty to the company that had been spent, but because I'd spent 17 years building relationships with people who had trusted Hargrove, partly on the strength of their trust in me. If my knowledge could prevent clients from being blindsided or misled, I had an obligation to provide it. I wore a suit. I hadn't worn one in 3 weeks. It felt both familiar and strange, the way anything feels when it belongs to a chapter of your life that has formally ended. The boardroom had the same conference table where I'd once stayed until 2 a.m. renegotiating a carrier contract to prevent a service disruption. I recognized the whiteboard in the corner where I'd drawn the diagram of our client tier structure that had eventually been incorporated into our sales training. It had been 9 years since I'd drawn that diagram. It was still there. The founder sat at the head of the table. He looked older than I remembered from the holiday party. Or perhaps just tired in a specific way that comes from realizing a mistake cannot be undone, only managed. My former boss sat to his right, flanked by the general counsel and a woman I didn't recognize who turned out to be from the board's outside legal firm. He started by apologizing. He was direct about it and didn't try to frame it as a strategic misunderstanding or a communication failure. He said that eliminating my role without a transition plan had been a mistake, and that the manner in which it had been done was not consistent with how he believed the company should treat people who had given it 17 years. I acknowledged the apology without performing gratitude I didn't feel. The general counsel walked me through a list of accounts with open questions. For each one, I provided what I knew, what commitments existed, in what form, based on what context. I was thorough because that's how I approach professional responsibilities, not because I owed them thoroughness at that point, but because the information I was providing would ultimately affect people lower in the food chain who had done nothing wrong. When we got to the Atlanta account, I explained the rate adjustment conversation and confirmed it had been a genuine agreement made in good faith by both parties. My new boss, who had been silent for most of the meeting, said something then. He said the company's policy was that verbal agreements without written confirmation were not binding, and that the account should be managed according to the current rate structure. The general counsel looked at him with the careful neutrality that attorneys deploy when they're about to explain why someone is incorrect. A verbal contract is legally enforceable in this state under certain conditions, she said. And more importantly, 11 years of client history built on relationship-based trust is not an asset we want to voluntarily destroy over a rate differential. My new boss said that the new client management approach would rebuild those relationships more efficiently through the system. The founder looked at the table for a long moment. "How many accounts," he said quietly, "have we lost or are at risk of losing in the past 3 weeks?" The head of sales had prepared a summary. She read from it without inflection because the numbers spoke for themselves. 4 accounts had terminated or were in formal notice periods. 9 were actively evaluating competitors. The total at-risk revenue was between $11 and $14 million annually, depending on how the next 60 days resolved. My new boss started to say something about the adjustment period being normal in any transformation. The founder held up one hand. The room went quiet. He looked at me and asked the same question the board member had asked in the Phillips Tech story, the kind of question that sounds simple but lands like a stone. What would it take to fix this? I'd thought about this before coming in. I'd actually written notes. Not because I was angling for anything by that point. I'd already spent 2 weeks setting up a consulting practice out of my home office, and I had my first 2 client inquiries sitting in my email, but because the question was legitimate and deserved a serious answer. The accounts that have already left, I said, you should write those off for now. Pursue them in 6 months through a formal reacquisition effort. Trying to call them back immediately will read as desperation and make the situation worse. The general counsel was taking notes. The accounts still in the evaluation period can be saved, but only through direct personal outreach, not through the system, not through email, phone calls, meetings, ideally in person. Someone has to show up and demonstrate that Hargrove understands what the relationship has meant and is willing to invest in reestablishing it. "Can you do that?" the founder asked. "Not as an employee." He was quiet, but I'd consider a 6-month consulting engagement. I would handle direct outreach on the 9 at-risk accounts, provide a full written knowledge transfer for every key account relationship I managed, and train your new client team on the relationship model that built this business. At the end of 6 months, Hargrove would own everything that's currently in my memory. The general counsel asked about terms. I had a number in mind. I said it. Nobody in the room flinched, which told me it was probably lower than what the at-risk revenue justified. I wasn't trying to extract maximum value from a crisis I hadn't created. I just wanted to be compensated fairly for work I was actually doing. My new boss looked like he wanted to object. The founder looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has learned, expensively, the limits of his own judgment about who in a room understands the business. We agreed to terms before the meeting ended. Over the following 6 months, I recovered 7 of the 9 at-risk accounts. Not all of them came back to full contract value. Immediately, trust, once uncertain, doesn't snap back to full extension overnight, but they stayed, and they stabilized. And the relationships were documented and transferred in a way they never had been before. The Atlanta account signed a 3-year renewal at the agreed rate. Their logistics director told me over the phone, in a tone that was both professional and faintly amused, that he was relieved someone had shown up to actually know what they were talking about. My new boss resigned in month 4. The company's press release described it as a mutual decision to pursue new opportunities. I read it from my home office, where I was on the phone with my 3rd consulting client, a mid-sized distribution company that had hired me to audit their account relationship infrastructure after reading about what had happened at Hargrove in a regional business journal. The founder called me in month 6, the week before the consulting engagement formally ended. "I want to offer you your position back," he said. "Full reinstatement, director level, with a compensation adjustment and a formal succession planning mandate, whatever you need." I had been expecting this call. I'd thought about how to answer it and had arrived at the same place I always arrive when I think clearly about what I want my professional life to look like at 54 years old. "I appreciate that, and I mean it," I said. "What you built at Hargrove is real, and I'm proud of the part I played in it. But I've spent 17 years being the person everyone assumed would always be there, and I think it took getting fired on a Zoom call in front of 300 people to make me understand that I was undervaluing myself by staying comfortable." He was quiet for a moment. "You built something significant here." "I did," I said, "and I've taken the most important part of it with me." By the time the engagement closed, my consulting firm had 4 full-time clients and 2 on retainer. I'd hired a part-time assistant to help manage the scheduling, My wife had converted our guest room into a second home office because I kept running out of desk space. Hargrove sent me a referral, one of their carrier partners, looking for someone to audit their client relationship practices without me having to ask. Word travels in this industry. When a company learns a lesson as publicly and expensively as Hargrove did, people in adjacent businesses start quietly wondering if they have the same vulnerabilities. They usually do. The last time I drove past the Hargrove building, I passed it on the way to my gym, which I've been going to consistently since I started working for myself, because I finally control my own calendar. I noticed they'd put up a new sign near the entrance with their updated company tagline, something about data-driven excellence. The sign looked sharp and modern and cost what those signs usually cost. I wondered if the person who approved the sign knew the name of the client who had been with Hargrove the longest. I wondered if they knew why that client had stayed. I knew. I had it written down. I had it transferred to the team before I left. Some knowledge can be documented. Some has to be earned. I've been in this business long enough to know the difference, and expensive enough now that the companies who need to know the difference know where to find me. My assistant forwarded me 3 new inquiries this morning. I'll get to them after lunch. I'm a little backed up right now.